According to the World Bank, 56% of the world's population live in cities. That's 4.4 billion of us. And it's only going to get more crowded over time. More people means more cars, more roads, more housing, and more loss of green space. Zuhura Plummer has lived in some of the most overpopulated and polluted cities on Earth, Mumbai in India and Ulaanbaatar in Mongolia. Now a resident of Oxford and campaign director of Oxfordshire Liveable streets, Zuhura talks to MetroWild about redesigning our urban landscapes to prioritise our well-being and interrelationships. Our wide-ranging conversation also takes in how we can all work together to minimise pollution, congestion and ill health in our cities. This is the MetroWild podcast, where we celebrate city life and wild nature. I'm your host, Yang-May Ooi. My guest today is Zuhura Plummer. Zuhura Plummer is the campaign director for Oxfordshire Liveable Streets. Before that, her roles included fundraising, communications, and relationship management in the international development and social entrepreneurship sector. She then took a deep breath, left secure work, and started her own business as a graphic recorder, or live scribe, using visuals to help people communicate. She did that for 6 years, and it is still limping along despite Oxford's traffic policies. The thread running through her work is helping to explain complex ideas more simply. She has lived in Colchester, Mumbai, Ulaanbaatar, London, and has now settled in Oxford. That was 9 years ago, 6 of which were on a Dutch barge on the River Thames. She walks, cycles, and also owns a small car. She drives it as infrequently as possible and values those car journeys very much. I began by asking Zuhura about what it was like living in Mumbai and Ulaanbaatar.
I did love each of them individually, but I know that I definitely, of all the places that I've loved living. So Ulaanbaatar is an incredible city. It's in this kind of bowl of mountains. It gets very, very cold in winter. It will get to about -25, -35 in winter. It's kind of full of like Soviet-style planning and architecture, grid-like streets, big squares, and then a lot of like slum areas outside the city, which are in like kind of informal settlements, like in what we would think of as yurts. They're called gers in Mongolia. And it's very polluted, very, very polluted, because it's powered by coal-fired power stations, which they located within the city, within the bowl of mountains. And so it literally, the air quality, you can see it like it's a thick black line across the top of the city. And you can climb out onto the mountains outside and see it hanging above the city. I really liked Mongolia, actually. I really liked the people. And I loved the kind of culture and the history and all that kind of element of it. But it was quite a tough city. Like, it was very, very polluted, very, very traffic heavy, lots of big cars. And because it's very cold, people like getting in the cars and keeping warm. Although it's surprising how much you can walk around at -25 because you wear completely different clothes. Then I moved to Mumbai and absolutely loved Mumbai. But in many ways, I absolutely hated it. And I remember being just completely desperate one day for some green space. Like, I just wanted to lie on grass. That was my overriding desire. I woke up one morning, I was like, I have to lie on some grass. And it's very, very crowded. It's very, very noisy. It's full of people. I used to joke that you can't, look at any scene within sort of a few metered squares and not see a human being. People would be crammed in ways that we just can't comprehend in this country. I remember coming back to Victoria Station in rush hour in London. And there was taxis and buses and the roadworks going on, and like people everywhere. It was rush hour, and looking around, being like, "Wow, it's just tranquil. Like, where are all the people?" I mean, it just felt absolutely like totally different. I remember one time in Mumbai, I was in a taxi going through Dharavi, which is like a very large slum there, and in the middle of the road, there's a sort of concrete barrier to stop people crossing into the other lane. And there was a man crouched on the barrier preparing cauliflowers. He had a sack of cauliflowers to one side, which he chopped. He had a sack of cauliflowers that were unchopped on the other side of the barrier. And that is the only space that will always stay with me, as to how crowded that is. And I think people are very good at getting used to things. And it kind of terrifies me how much we get used to stuff and how much we're prepared to put up with things if that change happens incrementally, and how we think that's normal. And that's something I really worry about with climate change and with the loss of nature, that we think that the amount of nature that we see now is normal, and it's not. And if you could see the difference over, 20, 30 years side by side, you would be completely shocked. But because we see a slow incremental change over the long term, we kind of get used to it. And I think the same is with crowding and traffic and noise and pollution. We just kind of accept it and think it's normal. So Mumbai was intense. It really formed my experience of what I know that I need to be happy. And I know that I need access to nature very quickly.
I just want to pick up on your point about incremental change. And actually on the MetroWild blog, one of the first posts I wrote about was fireflies in the garden. And this was about my childhood. And I'm ancient, so about 50 years ago, I was about 10. And I remember seeing fireflies in this suburban garden in Kuala Lumpur in Malaysia. And I was there recently, a couple of years ago, 2021, and it struck me that there were no fireflies. And actually, I was chatting to my mum, and she said, do you remember when you were young, you could also hear frogs and crickets and all these night sounds, night birds, and they're not really there anymore. And we looked out into the garden, and we were struck by how 50 years ago, it was absolutely dark in this particular suburb. And now there's ambient light. There's lights from the houses around, spotlights into their gardens. In the far distance, we could see the spectacular twin towers of Kuala Lumpur. And the night sky it wasn't dark. It was just this sort of hazy grey that you get when you get reflected light. And I guess it took me 50 years to realize, where have all the fireflies gone? And you're absolutely pinpointed it, this incremental change that we don't realize. Let's come now to your deciding to live in Oxford and the contrast of that.
I absolutely love living in Oxford. I moved here in about 2015 when I was changing my whole life. And I came because I'd had a long-term connection to Oxford. My dad lived here from when I was a very young girl. My parents split up. And so I used to come here once every 3 weeks to see him. And so it felt like somewhere that was like home, but it wasn't exactly like going home to my hometown. And then I just decided to stay, and I just really liked it. And I moved onto a boat. So I lived on a Dutch barge on the River Thames. And this was mainly economic. I knew how expensive housing was in Oxford. I didn't at that point have kind of regular income, and I was trying a new career. I was freelancing and proceeded to live on it for the next 6-7 years. I had no idea what I was doing, never lived on a boat before. I don't think I even knew what a hull was when I first decided to. And the experience was absolutely incredible. I'm incredibly glad I did it. I'm also quite glad I'm not still on it. It really allowed me to live very centrally in Oxford. I was on the Thames near Iffley, which is a very lovely village, which I would never be able to afford in a million years to live anywhere near if I wasn't on the boat. And it meant I had very, very easy cycling up and down the towpath. And it's not a life for everybody by any means. It's hard work, and you've got to think about water and your basic needs and electricity and all kinds of things. But it meant I was incredibly close to nature. And so you really, really notice the weather in ways that you don't otherwise. You notice the seasons, the changing of the seasons. You can hear things on the river, like birds, and you have a kind of private view of like one of the most beautiful parts of Oxford. I just loved waking up every morning and seeing river, trees and sky, and river, trees and sky. It gave me a very strong sense of the seasons and a very strong connection to nature that I just feel will never leave me now. And whatever happens, and when I'm really down or really depressed, I need to get out. Like that is what I need to go and look at some trees, and it saves me every time. Like nature is always there, whatever the weather, whatever the seasons. There's always something beautiful, whether it's big or small or tiny.
So we've touched on livability, and we've thrown this word about, and we'll come on to what Oxford Liveable Streets is all about in a moment. But let's just dig into this concept. What is livability generally?
Well, I'm sure there's an academic definition of it somewhere, but I haven't read all of that stuff. So I will give you my definition of it. I think for me, it's being able to move around easily in a way that suits you, where you have a bit of choice. So if you want to drive, you can drive. If you want to cycle, you can cycle, and it's safe enough, and you feel that it's safe enough, and you've got somewhere to store your bike that's secure. That's a very big issue. And if you want to walk, you've got like pleasant pavements, and it's not choked with fumes, and you can get past because there aren't cars parked to deliver it. And you have services that are near you, so you don't have to go to the other end of town for absolutely different things all over the place. You have childcare or a post office or a pharmacy or something nearby, so you have the ability to stay close if you want to. If you choose to go to a different school or have a doctor's surgery far away, that's absolutely up to you, but you've got the ability to have something near you. And that's probably what I think of as livability. I also love bumping into people. So stop and chat is like one of my favourite things in the whole wide world. And one of the reasons I love Oxford is how much I bump into people and how much I recognise people and how many people I know. And those like small micro interactions are so important to me. And I believe they're very, very important to us as human beings and our mental health. And I think there's a part of livability that you can stop and chat. You have the ability to hear each other over the sound of engines, or stand and it's pleasant on the pavement, or even, stand on the road if it's a quiet road. So that's kind of what livability means to me.
So I now live in Oxford, and this is how we got to know each other. But I lived for, 20, 30 years in London. And London is absolutely huge. There are about 8 million people. But coming to Oxford, it's pretty much every single day that I pop out to the shops or whatever, there is someone I know. And it may not be a best buddy, but it may be the little old lady down the street, and we say hello. And for her, that's a nice thing, because she's walking along, she's gone to the bus stop, and I walk past, we have a few minutes chat, and it just... people, there's a very corny thing, we need people. And there's that just lovely interaction, even though it's just skimming the surface of one's life and feeling part of a community. So let's now dive into what is this organisation, Oxford Liveable Streets, all about.
So Oxfordshire Liveable Streets is an organisation that was started about 5-6 years ago. And it was a group of people in Oxford who wanted to have more livable streets and less traffic driving through largely residential streets, but also kind of push for more walking and cycling friendly policies and car restriction. Let's call it what it is. The policies that we argue for do involve capping car use. And I really firmly believe that unless you do have that side of things, people are unlikely to change to walking or cycling or getting the bus, because we are very used to cars. It's very habitual. Lots of people don't really think about other ways to get around. And unless you have a deadline, when you don't get a job done until you've got a deadline, it's a little bit like that. Like you need something to help you to change. Cars are phenomenally useful. In rural areas, they add a huge amount of value. Like it's very, very hard to replicate with bus services in rural areas, the choice and the convenience and the flexibility that a car can offer. But in urban areas, the more cars there are and the more people there are and the more densely populated an area, the more number of buildings, the downsides of cars become much, much greater. And so Oxford is a very densely populated city. And so Oxfordshire Liveable Streets has been campaigning for these kinds of changes for a long time now. And so some of them people will know, low traffic neighbourhoods, LTNs. We also have something called traffic filters, which are going to be going into Oxford across the city toward the end of this year. October or November 2024. And then another series of policies that are in the kind of pipeline, an expanded zero emission zone and a workplace parking levy. And we have a very ambitious, brave administration at the moment who are in County Hall, who are trying these policies. And they're really trying them in the absence of any kind of national policies to limit people's car use. There's nothing coming from national government. So county councils are left to come up with different things themselves in different areas. So in London, we've obviously got ULEZ. In Birmingham, Bristol, there's a clean air zone. In Manchester, they've gone for something else. So it's a real patchwork at the moment. And honestly, what we need is a national policy. But in the absence of that, they are trying this. The reason that it's very important in Oxford is because we are a really growing county. And I think that's one of the things that people who are opposed to the policies either don't fully realise, like, or don't fully appreciate, or don't have a solution. So there are a lot of people who are opposed to them, to LTNs or traffic filters, for a wide variety of reasons. The change is difficult for some groups of people more than others, and some very genuine reasons there. And then there's some more like ideological reasons. But in all of my conversations, I say to people, there are about 600,000 more cars entering the UK's roads every year. 600,000 more cars entering the UK's roads. That's like a medium-sized city in the UK every single year. We just can't keep sustaining the rate of driving and the number of cars on the road. And I think that we as a society don't tend to see the negative things that cars do. And the obvious ones that they kill people, pollution from tailpipes, people are very aware of. But there are things that we're less aware of, such as the microplastics from tyres and brake pads. So tyres wear down over time. The tiny, tiny, tiny particles that wear off the tyre as you drive them go into the water supply. And they're now pretty much in every single part of the world, from Antarctica to, they break down over time and they're small enough to cross the lung barrier and into our bloodstreams. And the two things that kind of really get me about the microplastics from tyres is they did a study recently at St Bart's, and it was Queen Mary University, and they showed up in 100% of the placentas of unborn babies. So unborn babies are hanging out with bits of old tyre. And these are not women in highly polluted parts of Oxford and not smoking, and they're fairly sure that those microplastics are from tyres. And I just sort of think, how can you hear that and not think, maybe we should drive a bit less? Maybe we should just kind of reduce how much we drive. And certainly drive lighter, smaller vehicles, because the heavier and bigger the vehicle, the more microplastics it produces. But also cars take up a huge amount of space in urban areas that are really, really precious space. So streets, for example, are lined with cars, parked, and they haven't got trees on them. So it's a cost in terms of the opportunity loss. And trees are absolutely fantastic for slowing down intense heavy rain. So you stop flash flooding with tree cover. And they're also fantastic for keeping our streets cool in heat waves. And they're also brilliant for people's mental health. So they are a kind of pretty much, amazing thing. But if you have to take out like 15 car parking spaces to put trees in, people will complain and object, and they want their car to be there. But if you get used to it and you've got more options and you can live in a genuinely car-free way, because buses work, because they're fast, because there's lots of routes, because you can cycle, because you feel safe, because you let your kids cycle to school by themselves, you don't have to do the school drop-off, then you might be able to get rid of your car, might have to share cars, so we have fewer cars on the streets and we can have more trees. So there's lots and lots of things about cars that are really negative. But I mean, I own one and I don't drive it very frequently, but I really value the journeys I do make on it. And I drive the smallest, lightest car I can. They are absolutely brilliant for some things, but it's just about people having choice and about thinking that they have other options, like genuinely feeling that they have other options. And sadly, sometimes that means like saying, no, actually, you can't drive. You need to find a different way of doing this.
I'm particularly struck by London, which has the congestion zones. And also way, way back, I'm old enough to remember back in the day when Trafalgar Square was a glorified roundabout. This is one of the hugest, most significant monuments. Nelson's Column and the Four Lions and those fountains were just stuck on this roundabout. People couldn't get to it. There was congestion and there was just constant hooting and people getting all irate. And I think in the late 1980s, early 1990s, there were plans put forward to pedestrianise the bit between the National Gallery at the top of the incline and connect it to the square. And the outcry was absolutely, oh my goodness, why are they doing this? It's all absolutely fine. This is what we've got used to. It was forced through despite objections. And now look at Trafalgar Square. All along that area, there are street performers, people walk around. There's little small businesses, selling balloons or whatever it is. And you can walk across down into the fountains and really enjoy that. And it has become a central place for gatherings, for meetings, for political rallies. And it showcases the glorious, landmark that this is. Also, I remember Somerset House, which is along the Strand. It has this beautiful cobbled courtyard in this square with these wonderful Georgian facades. And for a long time, it was just a car park. All you could see were cars. And then again, they got rid of the car parking, and I'm sure the sort of people who worked there were like, where am I going to park my car? But now it's this wonderful square. I would urge you all to go and visit if you can. It's public space. There are fountains, kids can play, and the beauty of those Georgian facades has been restored because it was meant for pedestrians to walk in, because they were built at a time when people had to walk and they had horses and carriages. And I believe, I haven't been to London, that part of London for a while, but I believe that part around Aldwych has also been pedestrianised. So I imagine there's been some traffic problems, but actually it has enhanced London as a place where people can walk and enjoy quiet and more healthy air. The other thing I want to also say is, of course, I have a car as well. And in London, I hardly ever used it because there was no real need. And it's like, well, you're really stupid if you want to drive into central London, because you can take the bus. And okay, the bus can take a long time, or suburban trains. And the Oyster card has made it really easy.
Yeah.
And I remember in London, I would never go to places like Croydon or where those big warehouses were, where IKEA was out of town. So I never shopped from IKEA back in the day before internet ordering, because it was so difficult to get to. And certainly it's about in Oxford having the choice that I can pop down to my local shop, buy a pint of milk, but equally I can get into my car, drive up onto the ring road, onto the ring road, and go to these warehouse places. And I keep saying every time I get onto the ring road, oh my goodness, I'm here in 10 minutes and I'm off to somewhere exciting. Whereas in London, after an hour's driving, I am still stuck in Croydon or somewhere. But I want to address and perhaps speak to the car drivers who may be listening, who may feel that the whole point of livable streets and low traffic neighbourhoods is somehow to get at them, to stop them having, the convenience of driving a car that they've been used to. And one might feel attacked by these new, potentially new ways of doing things.
I definitely sympathise with groups who find it harder to change. So I've got a terrible knee at the moment and I'm on crutches, and I use my car today somewhere I would never normally drive in a million years, and I really appreciated it and having it. So I don't think it's about attacking any one individual's choices. Everybody is making the most rational choices they can with the information, resources, abilities that they have at the time. I definitely think it's about kind of systemic change and making it easier for people to make better choices. So I would get rid of my car if there was cheaper car sharing effectively. That's I've thought about it very clearly, and I'm I want it for about 2 weeks of the year in the summer when I go on holiday, and then the rest of the time I would very happily share a car. But there isn't quite yet the infrastructure for car sharing in that kind of way yet, but I don't think we're very far away. With LTMs and traffic filters, people view it very much in terms of it's a loss, it's a reduction, how much I'm driving is a cap. It's framed quite negatively, partly because it's hard to communicate it clearly without naming what it is, which it is making it less convenient to drive so that the other options become more convenient. And so you're tilting the scales, or you're making driving less convenient, but you're also speeding up the buses with the traffic filters, making walking and cycling safer with the LTNs. But I can totally see why, for people's individual lives with care and responsibilities, work, and people are under an enormous amount of pressure, especially parents of small children. And I have a lot of sympathy. I think the thing that I keep going back to again and again and again with the traffic filters and the LTNs is, what is the alternative? Because I don't see a good end game for just driving wherever you want, wherever you like, all the time. 40% of journeys are under 2 miles. I mean, that is a phenomenal number of journeys that are under 2 miles. And the vast majority of those people will be able to have done it in a different way. They won't necessarily be physically disabled or be carrying huge amounts of things. It's very hard to imagine your life differently when you haven't yet made the change, when you haven't experienced it, when you haven't felt it, when you haven't seen someone who looks like you cycling, when you haven't gone, oh, actually, yeah, I could go that. And if I can't drive, then I'll go this way. And then, oh, there's a shortcut through there. I didn't know I could cycle up that route. And actually, I don't have to go on the main road. But unless you have a point at which you need to change, you don't go and look at that and explore it and think about it and imagine you doing something in a different way. I think it's also about people getting used to it and habits and time. And that's why it's so important, getting kids walking and cycling to school, because you get those habits in early and they will think that is normal and they will just do it and they will be confident and they will be able to cycle and walk to school, and you will see change going up over the years. We have basically, for the last 50 years or more, probably since the war, we've basically designed around cars. We've basically gone, how many people are we going to have? How many cars are they going to have? Okay, we need to build this many roads to meet the needs of those many cars. And that's called predict and provide. You predict how many cars you're going to need and you provide the roads for them. But now we know that you can never provide enough road space. So the easier you make it to drive, the more people will drive. And you put another lane on and it will fill up with traffic, because people will go, oh, I can just get over to that town there. I can get a job over there and I'll drive over there. And then sometimes that's really great because they have more choice. But in other times, it wouldn't be a loss that they couldn't do that, because they wouldn't have thought of doing that, if that makes sense. So I don't think about getting a job in Aberdeen because I can't get to Aberdeen. But if they suddenly could get there in 20 minutes on a magic motorway, I might think about it. Essentially, the more roads you build, the more people drive and the more cars will fill them. And so we're moving to something called decide and provide. So we decide that, okay, we want lots of people to get around by bus, we want lots of people to get around by bikes, we want lots of people to be walking and cycling, we want deliveries to be more innovative and all go to one spot and then be going out on cargo bikes. We decide that some people definitely need to drive because they absolutely have to, like, builders and plumbers and people with blue badges. But we'll provide for those things and then people will use them. And I really do believe that, like, people will change, but it does take time. It is hard. Like, it's hard to shift habits, and people built their lives around being able to drive wherever they want, wherever they like, all of the time. And I really do sympathize with that, especially if you are have mobility issues, especially if you are a single parent, especially if you are on a 0-hours contract or you're low paid. It is not easy. But the alternative is that we have a growing population. We have 100,000 houses going up across Oxfordshire in the next sort of 10-year period that we have. And that's 142,000 more cars. Like, we are all going to be sitting in traffic unless we do something, unless we change something. We just get used to it taking 40 minutes to get from one side of Oxfordshire to the other side of Oxfordshire, and it doesn't have to be like that. We can create better services, but you do have to at some point take some cars off the road. If you want the buses to run, you have to have less congestion. And there's no two ways around that. Nobody can come up with a way of less congestion without everybody driving less.
So I'm remembering, again, 60 years ago or thereabouts in Malaysia, in Kuala Lumpur, after dinner, my dad would say, let's go for a drive. And we'd pile in the car. And back in the day, I was 2 years old, I'd be standing on the back seat. And now we think, oh my God. So back in the day, we didn't have seatbelts. Now we have seatbelts. And so that change happened. And I remember people were very upset when seatbelts were introduced because it was a restriction on their freedom. And I know my grandmother would pretend to have her seatbelt on. She'd hold it in front of her when she saw a policeman, which sort of defeats the point of it. But anyway, so I was standing on the back seat. We go round and round this roundabout, which had a fountain that changed colour because of coloured lights. And we go around for I don't know how long. And that was doable because there were fewer cars back in 1965. Now you say to someone, let's go for a drive after dinner. I think you'd be absolutely mad because you just sit in traffic. Which then brings me to my other point, which is about the built environment. So very simplistically, America was built for cars. So huge highways. Usually British people say they've come back from LA and they were people would just look at them as if they were mad, or the police would stop and ask them, why are you walking along this street or this road? Because nobody walks in LA. Everybody's in their cars. But I'm remembering this lovely little medieval town in the south of France, Nîmes. And the old city was built for pedestrians, because back in the 600 years ago, nobody even had horses and carriages, and the width is about maybe 2 people across, and it's got steps, so you walk up the steps, and it's beautiful, enchanting little place. In the summer that we were there, they closed off I suppose they didn't need to close off any roads because cars would have to park outside the ring road that ringed the medieval city. And tables were outside. You'd sit in front of the restaurants, you'd drink, and they had this jazz festival, and people were literally dancing in the streets. Mm-hmm. And you can imagine the French, very suave, very cool, doing their, jazz dancing, and we were completely blown away. And so it's about what it is built for. And I think it touches on what you were saying about building for the new generation, that highway planners, city planners have to think about how they adapt modern design to enable people to live healthy, well-balanced lives where they can actually get to where they want to get to. What you're saying is that it's just taking the time to think, well, do I need to get into the car to go to X? Could I walk? Could I take the bus? Could I cycle? So if, let's say, there are 100 people, just to use a sample, of which, 80 are pretty much able-bodied, they're not too much in a hurry, they don't have the issues around disability or childcare or whatever. If they stopped getting into their cars, that leaves only 20 cars on the road. And if of those 20 people, some people that, well, actually, yes, you could take the bus on your crutches a little bit later on when your knee has healed a little bit, and it's less painful. So of that, maybe 5 people will take the bus. That leaves only 15 cars on the road. And if you can picture a road with 100 cars reduced to 15 cars and 1 bus full of other people, then actually the traffic's going to flow much more quickly. And isn't really that's what you're talking about? You're not saying, don't ever drive. We're going to, smash everybody's cars. You're just saying, have a think, see what the next best alternative might be in the given moment.
That's exactly the point of the traffic filters and the RTNs. You just have to think about it a bit more, and you have to plan your journey a bit more. And that extra bit of friction, you go, actually, you know what? It's just as easy to walk on. Might as well just walk. And people are making all these tiny decisions every day, and they do the habits are hard to break. You have to do something, you have to change something, do something different. You can't just say to people, oh, please get out, please stop driving so much, please just get out of your car. That's another thing that I hear a lot. People say, I totally agree with what you're saying, but I don't think people should be restricted. I don't think there should be any laws, or they should just be allowed to drive as much as they want, but we'll just tell them. And I'm like, good luck with that. It just won't happen. We don't get, please pay your taxes. You don't want to do it on an individual level. So you need a point of change, and you need to just help people think. And the numbers that you're talking about are actually that would be amazing. I mean, if we had 80% reduction in journeys, we would think of it as almost like empty roads. The numbers you need to change are actually really small. So the difference between term time traffic in Oxford and non-term time traffic is about 15%. And the difference is huge. If I drive in school holidays, I'm like, oh my God, there is so much space on the roads. And it's only 15% fewer cars. I mean, they're concentrated in peak hours. So, it may not be 15% on any one road at any one point, but overall in a day, it's 15%. And you could even have 40, 60% of people carrying on driving. If you think about traders and plumbers and people who are disabled, people who have got more complex connected journeys, people who are carrying things, there's quite a lot of people who do need to drive for different reasons. But the numbers that you shift, you don't have to shift that many. And so the county council's target is to reduce the number of car journeys by 1 in 4 by 2030. And that's a series of measures. So that's the LTNs, that's the traffic filters, the ZD, a workplace parking levy, and also getting people on, onto buses and walking and cycling. And so that's only 25%. And to just give you a sense of that, if you got, say, like one of the large employers, say like BMW or one of the hospital trusts, if you got 20% of the staff car sharing, 2 people in each car, and let's assume it won't get to 3 people in each car, that's a 10% reduction straight away. So you're getting like school holiday levels of traffic without anyone actually having to walk or cycle or get the bus. That's just car sharing. If you do get another 10% of people on the bus, then that's great. And if you get another 5% of people on a bike, that's also fantastic. And if you get another 5% of people who maybe walk or scoot, or we say walking and wheeling in the world that I'm in, because wheeling encompasses people in wheelchairs, mobility scooters, electric scooters, or prams and buggies. So various people wheeling in different ways. So you might get a kind of reduction there. And so that would be in total, I think that's about 25% reduction, which I've just outlined. And that would be huge. I mean, that would be transformative. And the rest of the traffic flows. And that's the point that I keep going back to again and again as well. Like at the moment, people are sitting in cars who are able-bodied doing short journeys. And they're holding up traders, they're holding up builders, they're holding up midwives trying to get to appointments who are going all over the whole county. They're holding up people who are disabled who don't have any other choices. And you leave the roads for the people who need them. And I don't know a fairer way of doing it than the traffic filters, because the filters get passes to people and then they give exemptions to people who find it harder to change. And the other option was a congestion charge in Oxford. And in some ways it's a lot simpler, but in other ways you would just, if you were rich, you would just pay it. And I don't think that we would have to see a reduction in congestion. And I think that's actually quite an unfair model, because it is a very wealthy county, and it's a very wealthy city. So a lot of people would be able to afford to pay it. And so you'd have to set the charge really high to actually have an impact on congestion. And it would be totally punitive for poorer people.
Yes, and I think that would be very, very unfair, because then only the rich could drive, and then that just causes more class division. So I think a couple of points that, again, you've made me think about is, sometimes I sit in traffic because I've chosen the wrong time to go. And I could have waited and not gone in rush hour, but I'm sitting there going, oh my God, there's so much traffic. I wait a beat and I think, I am traffic.
Yeah.
So I'm 60, coming on 61 this year. In London, I walked everywhere. And so now I think from where I live in East Oxford to walk to the Westgate Centre to do a bit of shopping is a 40 to 45-minute walk up along the high street. Or actually, the most beautiful walk is 45 minutes up along the river that takes me up to Folly Bridge and along. And actually, it's my exercise. So I do 45-minute walk, and at the end of it, I do some shopping, I have lunch, I think, oh gosh, I feel so virtuous. And if I'm completely laden with shopping, which can happen if I don't leave my credit card behind, I jump on the bus and I'm home in 15 minutes. But if I really want to kind of exercise my muscles, I carry my shopping and I'm toning my arm muscles as I walk back another 45 minutes. Then, of course, I've got one of those awful sort of smartwatches things, and it tells me, and I've done 15,000 steps today, hurrah. And I say this lightly, of course, and of course, not everybody can do that, but it's about taking the choice and trying to reframe it. I'm all about reframing things in a positive way. I've got another podcast called The Anxiety Advantage, where I tried to encourage people to reframe anxiety as a friend and an ally. So I'm hoping that people listening might try to find fun, different ways of reframing something that is experienced as a restriction as something fun, something playful, something that is actually helpful to the community.
There's a very, very serious point there about being sedentary, which I just will talk about in a minute. And then I also want to talk about co-benefits. So this study absolutely blew my mind, but it was Royal College of Surgeons, published last year or 2 years, anyway, very recently, and just doing 20 minutes of light exercise a day. So getting slightly out of breath to the point that you can still have a conversation, but you're a little bit breathing a little bit heavily, kind of fast walking for some people, reduces your risk of heart disease by 40%, diabetes by 40%, osteoporosis by 50%, depression by 30%. It was phenomenal. Like, it was unbelievable. Like, if it hadn't been a Royal College of Surgeons study that was right in front of me in black and white, I would literally have not believed it. And I was like, that is ridiculous. 10 different things, really common things that we are all facing now. And it said 70% of NHS spending is on those things. And I was like, we cannot afford it. If you love the NHS, if you love for having free healthcare, it cannot pick up all of the pieces of our sedentary lifestyle. You cannot sit down all the time and then expect the NHS to pick up the pieces. I'm sorry, like, it just, like, you have to work in activity into your everyday lifestyle. And that's the bit that's the only time where I feel slightly like I'm preaching at people, and I really try not to do it most of the time. But I really, really urge people to try and do activity as everyday part of their everyday life. People will drive to the gym, and I know there's particular exercises at the gym you need to do and things like this. I just think it's so hard. Like, you need time, you need money to do that. Lots of people are working until late, or, working, they've got kids and they're not going to make it to the gym, and they can't afford a gym membership. But if the streets are safe enough for them to cycle to work every day, they get it. They get their exercise, and they're just getting to work. And by doing exercise as part of just like moving your body, like we were, evolved to move, it has so many more benefits, and you're so much more likely to keep it up than if you try and get people to play sports or go to the gym or like take a particular thing. But if you're just moving in everyday life, so I couldn't agree with you more about that. And that's the thing that really, again, I keep coming back to about the traffic filters. And when people say this is really hard, I'm like, yeah, it's going to be really hard, but it's going to be really, really hard if we don't all start moving. But then it's also the co-benefits. So what you said is you walk along the river, you have a lovely time, you're getting your exercise, you're also getting to, and also the journey will take exactly however long it takes. Like, it's not going to take an unusual amount of time. You're not stuck in traffic and suddenly it's going to be doubling the amount of time. Like, it's going to take 40 minutes to walk there and 40 minutes to walk back. And it's just up to you, which I really like about kind of getting yourself around. But we'll talk about quickly something called the Car Free Challenge. So this happened in Oxford a couple of weeks ago. Really interesting. It was funded by this group called Possible and Oxford Low Carbon, Oxford north, and they challenged 12 people who drive everywhere to give up their car for 3 weeks. And they gave them, I think they got £100 because I think it wanted to cover things like bus fares and having you go and getting your bike serviced. They got given bikes if they didn't have bikes, but most people sort of had one in the back of the shed that they needed to dig out. And so they didn't get particularly any money from it. And they just recorded their thoughts at the beginning and their thoughts at the end and had video diaries and things in between. And everybody stuck with it. So nobody dropped out and got back to their car. A couple of people who were thinking about getting a second car in their household are now not going to. And one family who have got a second car are going to get rid of the second car. So it's not about necessarily going car free again for the rest of your life. But people, you need a bit of encouragement. Everyone needs a bit of encouragement. So they're self-selecting. You could say that these are people who wanted to give up the car anyway. They chose to go on the challenge, but they decided to, and they just were given a bit of encouragement. They were given some good routes. They were given some a free car bike maintenance thing. They were just given a period of time to do it for. And this one woman did it who drove all the time. And she said she now walks. It takes longer, but she walks with her 2 children to primary school and back every day. And her kids love it because they get to talk to her and ask questions. And she's not rushing around like trying to get them out of the house. And they walk along the pavement and they point at things and they have a conversation. And she says her kids absolutely love it. And so I think it takes her like 10 minutes longer or 15 minutes longer than it would do if she was in the car. And then on the way back, she phones her mum. And so she's phoning her mum every single day, and her mum's getting old and her mum's really appreciating that. And she's feeling good because she doesn't feel guilty about her mum. And so so the whole thing's taken a bit longer, but she has gotten a load of exercise. She's got happy children and she's got a happy mum. And like your relationships and your health are pretty much the 2 things. And she's saving money on petrol. That's just brilliant. And so you definitely have to talk about the co-benefits, and you have to talk about the extras. Sitting next to someone on the bus and having a chat. Loneliness and isolation are such a big thing as well. And like cars, we're all in like our individual cars. And I think there's a lot of people who say, well, this is all very well if you've got an extra bit of time, but I don't have any extra time. And that's true. And again, I really sympathise, but it's about setting your life up in a way that you can do that. And I think that one of the things we haven't talked about is housing and housing developments, but we are creating housing developments where people are really going to be dependent on cars because we're putting them on the outskirts of villages in rural areas with very poor public transport. And we're creating car dependency in the way that we are building houses in this country at the moment. And we could do it so much better. But also individuals can make choices to live in a way where they're going to be less car dependent. So I'm just lucky enough to be buying a house soon, and I've decided to go for a smaller house in a more densely populated area near a nice cycle path because I know that's my main way of getting around, and I won't spend any money on a car. I could put it into mortgage payments instead. And it's a choice I'm making. I'm making an active choice to like be smaller, shabbier, and close. And I think that's also a thing that we have to make that kind of aspirational instead of like big car, big house on its own, big fence around it, which I know lots of people really value. But if you are going to live like that and drive, often a very big car into a town centre and back every day, if you do want to live like that, then you have to pay for it. At the moment, society and everybody else is subsidising all the extra costs that your need to drive or your supposed need to drive everywhere is costing everybody else in terms of air pollution, road wear, accidents, microplastics, climate change, etc., etc., etc. Like that is having a cost on everybody. And at the moment we subsidise that as a society, and we've got to stop subsidising that.
So we've talked a lot about livability in terms of traffic, and that is the theme that often emerges when we mention livability. But let's talk about housing and development. How can we be more livable in the houses and the estates and the areas where we live?
So this is very pertinent for Oxfordshire. So to give people a context, because I know you'll have listeners all around the world, it's a county in the southeast of England. It's quite a prosperous county. It's also quite a rural county. We don't quite realise. And it's also, obviously, it's got the University of Oxford in Oxford. And then it's very close to London, and it's very close to sort of Milton Keynes and Cambridge. And so there is a plan it's called the England's Economic Heartland. And it's a plan to really flood the area with science and innovation and technology companies, because you're between Cambridge and Oxford, and you're between these two really, tons and tons of highly skilled area, good transport links to London, both of them individually, but terrible transport links to each other. And so there's a plan to build 1 million homes across this stretch, this sort of arc across the top of London. And Oxfordshire has 100,000 houses, which are either being built, in the process of being built, or will be built by about 2031. And in the southeast, it's about 1.42 cars per household. So 100,000 houses means about 142,000 cars. And at the moment, there's about 5 big housing developers in the country, and they have a monopoly between them on the market. And we're building estates out of town and all off-road parking, lots of garages, lots of places to park. Cars are the default way of getting around. If you live here, you will have a car. That is the kind of message, subliminally or whatever, that we're giving people. And some of these developments don't have pavements. There was one recently that I heard about. And they have very few bus stops or any bus services. And then you come out of the estate onto a very busy road. And they take up a lot of space. So we're cutting into greenbelt, we're cutting into wild areas, we're cutting into nature to put these houses up. And I feel personally really conflicted because I am relatively young. Well, I'm 40. I have friends who are my age, who are still living in caravans on people's driveways because they cannot afford housing in Oxford. I lived on a boat for 6 years and drank Thames River water because I couldn't really afford to live in Oxford. We do need to build housing, like we need affordable housing, but I think it has to be done in a completely transformative way. So there's a fantastic organisation which I urge listeners to go look up called Create Streets, and they have come up with a really detailed way of changing development from like big sprawling estates that are car dependent to closer, like living closer together. So it's called gentle density. So you're talking about density that may be like 3 stories, lots more flats, and maybe 3-4 stories, but not high rise. We're not talking about anything like going back to the 60s, 20-story kind of tower blocks. You're talking about kind of Parisian level density. And if you get the same number of properties into a smaller area at gentler density, what you have is firstly an ability to get into the countryside much more easily because the area you live in is actually much smaller. So on a big sprawling estate, it actually takes you 20 minutes to get to the countryside because you have to walk all the way through the housing estate, all the way through past its houses. Whereas if you're closer, it might take you 6 or 7 or 8 minutes, whatever. And then secondly, you have really beautiful public space and lots of greenery all around this density so that when you look out, you see trees, you have a shared square. It might be more shared than an individual private garden but it might also not be. There will be still some individual private gardens. There'd also be balconies. And so you might have lots and lots of more balcony gardening. Lots of people don't garden. Like we're ripping up greenbelt and we're putting in houses, each with their individual garden, each with a driveway, each, taking up a lot of space. And actually they just sit as squares of lawn and people, are not interested in it. So some people are, but some people are not. And so I think that creating flats, you have different choices. And then with the gentle density, you then have much more like shared car parking spots. You make sure you definitely have bus services. You make sure you definitely have like bike storage so people can store bikes easily, which is a very big deal in flats and terrace housing. And you build in like a way that people can live in a way that they have choice. And they did a real life study. So they looked at Cirencester, which has got some absolutely enormous housing estates going on greenbelt. And they reimagined it with the same money. And these housing estates need roads. And that's the thing that's really problematic because they are so expensive. So a new road, a short piece of road will cost about £70 million. And with £70 million, the things that you can do are phenomenal. You can do incredible bus services. You can add an extra train spot line or an extra bit of light rail to take you to a train station. You can give everybody an electric bike in the estate. You can do all these incredible things for the cost of one road. And I really urge you to look at that report if you're interested in housing and development. But we need to fundamentally change that in Oxfordshire, in the UK. And I really hope that report is going to reach the Labour Party because I know that they are very keen on building houses and they're likely to form the next government. But yeah, if there's anybody who's listening, please also tell your county councillors to read the report too.
I think it seems to me astonishing that nowadays there would be developers who would build developments with no pavements and no access to public transport. And that seems quite an archaic way of looking at things. Surely they must be aware of climate issues, overcrowding, pollution, all those kinds of things. So it just seems very, very short-sighted to me. There's something also, this is not for this conversation, but there are issues with just postage stamp or even bigger envelope, A4 envelope size lawns, because lawns, they get rid of the diversity of wildlife and they're just barren. And what you do to lawns in order to keep it looking green can be toxic to, the local wildlife. And I'm sure I can get an ecologist to come on the podcast and talk more in that, but I just wanted to flag that while I thought of it. But I want to speak to those people that you mentioned in the previous question around the people who have big cars, big houses. Listening to that, might someone who has worked really hard all their life, has aspired to having a big house and a nice car and room enough for children and their cars, and to have a sense of success that they deserve this house and they deserve this car that they've worked all their life for. So are you getting at them?
I mean, I certainly don't need to be getting at anybody on an individual level. My point is that in terms of like the space enormous houses take up, the amount of energy they take up to build, to heat, maintain, the amount of energy and dangers of large cars is so much more significant than that of small cars. That if you choose to live, if you want that, and that's a sign of success for you, I get it. Nice things are nice. Like, I really do understand, but it's not about them deserving it or not deserving it, but it is about people recognizing that a 4x4 is 8 times more likely to kill a child than a normal size small car, because the bonnet is much higher. It hits the child at head or chest, and they're much more likely to be pulled under the car than roll over the bonnet. And they do increase the microplastics. They do use up phenomenal amount of energy in producing the car than a normal size car. So you can have your feeling, they deserve it or whatever, that is fine. And I'm not about to ban them. I do personally think that we shouldn't be subsidizing it. That is what we're doing at the moment. They're not paying for the extended costs of driving those very, very large vehicles. I mean, even just the road wear alone, it's to the power of 4, the damage that wheels do. You have to times the weight of the car by to the power of 4. That's not 4 times, that's 4 times 4 times 4 times 4. And so they do an outsized amount of damage to roads, like a phenomenal. What people complain to me all the time about potholes, and I'm like, the thing that is causing potholes is extremely large cars. And so if you want to have them, fine, have them, but you have to pay for them. So that's, I think, the fairest way that I can think of putting it. And don't pretend that you don't do the harm. Be aware that if you make that choice, then you are going to be doing that harm. And I think that that's something that we just don't talk about very much, about the negative things that they do. And I think a lot of people don't know that much. I think a lot of people who do get them are doing it because they really care about their children and keeping their children safe. But then if they're like, oh, this actually is like several times more likely to kill a child, is that who I am? Am I really that person who wants to increase that much more microplastics? They probably care about microplastics. Most people do. And so it's about knowing that those are harms. But also we're sold, like, the car industry is a multi-billion-pound car industry. They are completely obsessed with selling us bigger and bigger and bigger cars and making more and more profit on them. And so it's become aspirational, and I get it. Like, advertising is incredibly powerful, and of course people want it,
Yeah, so I'm just picturing those car ads for 4x4s. They're zooming along this empty highway in Scotland, but actually most of us, if they actually had a real ad that reflected real experience, it would be that 4x4 sitting in traffic full of other 4x4s honking and with pollution. And actually that doesn't sell, that's not sexy. Adverts sell dreams, not reality. So we've talked about livability a lot also in the context of a city. What about a village in the countryside? We touched on it with these new developments where you can walk in the countryside in minutes and you can jump in your car, drive to a beautiful forest or mountain very easily. Who's to say that's not livable?
It depends how the village is set up, but that could be highly livable. So villages really, in the sort of old-fashioned sense of the term, like village shop, village post office, village pub, maybe like a village hall where you can communicate, congregate as a community, highly, highly livable. And originally we might have had many more rural buses, so you'd be able to get to your nearest town or place of work. So I think villages can be incredibly livable. What is problematic is big estates going up with no thought as to how people are going to get around and no services. So the nearest shop is your out of town enormous supermarket that's 4 miles away that of course you can't cycle to because it's like a dual carriageway. I think it's really important to not have a definition of what is livability. Some parts of Botley, which are in the west of the city, came up as very, very unwalkable. Like, you couldn't, and we mapped how far it was to walk to shops and services and house care and various things. And some particular parts, Littlemore came up as with poor livability. And then this back end of Botley, which is up a big hill. And I looked at it, and I happen to know that area because I've got some friends who live up there. And I was like, well, that's actually a really nice place to live because you can get right onto this lovely kind of bit of countryside. You've probably got as much cheaper housing there than it will be in like some parts of East Oxford, which are apparently very livable. And so you might be able to have a bigger house, you might be able to garden, which might be really important to you. You might be able to get out and walk your dog every morning or go for your jog or do whatever it is you want to do. And so what if you have to get on the car and drive for 5 minutes down the road to get your shopping? Does that make it not livable? Who am I to go around telling you've got to live in a very crowded little house in East Oxford and cycle everywhere? So I definitely challenge myself and check in with myself about that. I think it's about the density of the population and driving being the default. And if we keep building housing where driving is the default, if we keep not giving people somewhere secure to put their bikes so they cannot cycle anywhere because they have to keep their bikes on the street and a whole family cannot keep their bikes on the street. I know people keeping their bikes in the bath because they haven't got any storage in their tiny little Victorian terraced houses and they haven't got any side entrances. So all they need is some secure on-street bike parking, those covered things. So it's really important not to say what it is in each area. I do think we have to make sure that in our design, we make it really easy for people to make the best choices. And I passionately do believe that you have to restrict and help people to think about doing things in a different way at some point. You cannot just drive everywhere you want all the time, wherever you like, because otherwise people do not change. It's too hard to make those changes on your own. You have to feel like you're doing it together, and you have to feel like it's fair, and you have to feel like there's a point at which, okay, right, I've always meant to get a bit fitter and walk. I'll start doing that because of the traffic filters, because of the LTNs, because of the whatever. But you need a point when people don't just change by themselves, just from asking nicely.
It makes me think about smoking, because back in my young days, people would smoke everywhere. Smoke in the tube until the King's Cross fire, smoke on the plane, smoke everywhere. And then it was banned. Was it banned in public buildings, I think? The prices kept going up of cigarettes. And often we'd sit round after dinner and my 20-something friends would pull out their cigarettes. And it was just disgusting for a non-smoker like me. And then it became socially sanctioned in a way of people disapproved of smoking, in the way of drink driving. We used to drink at parties, get in a car. Now my friends, maybe also because we're older, when we come to a party, say, oh, actually I'm drinking, or, oh, I'm the designated driver, everybody else can have a great time. So all this has evolved over the last, single lifetime. And I'm hoping that with driving, and all these things we've been talking about, again, there will be a shift in mindset. And I think what we're looking at is a shift socially across the nation, across the globe, actually, because it's not just the UK that's affected by these issues, and across socially amongst communities, social peer groups, politically amongst the people who can make the decisions, the town planners who make the design, the government who offer funding for this, that, and the other, and they can always give funding more for this and less funding for that to affect people's behaviours. And so at an individual level, as well as at these very diverse social, global, national levels, it's about learning about the options that we have, the impact that we're having, taking responsibility for our choices.
Yeah.
And whether we live in a big house or a little house in the countryside where we have to drive, or in a little house in a densely populated area, it's about choice and personal responsibility. And I like that phrase where you said, I challenge myself to think about this. So let's challenge ourselves rather than actually saying, well, I'm right because I cycle all the time, or I'm right because I drive all the time, and being at loggerheads, to challenge ourselves to think about, if ultimately fossil fuels is going to run out because it's a finite resource. Climate change is a real thing. It's been proven by scientists. The toxicity of all these things, air pollution, microplastics, it's proven. So we can either just go blithely go, oh, well, I don't really care. It's not my responsibility. Or we think, well, I'm going to do my bit, whatever that bit is. And today I might need to drive, but tomorrow if I don't need to, what is my next best choice? So it's about challenging ourselves and thinking, what can I do in my little bit? And I may not be completely perfect, but I can do my little bit. So, Zuhura Plummer, what last words do you have for our listeners, whether they live in a city or somewhere in the countryside?
I think it's about curiosity and giving things a go and being open-minded. So thinking, do I have to jump in the car? Is there another way of doing this? Could I combine those journeys? Could I give my neighbour a lift? Or maybe we could get from 2 cars to 1 car and I might make a friend. Life is busy and God, it's difficult to make change. But realising that it can have lots of things, unexpected benefits. And I think the thing about taking responsibility for the impact that you're having is one that I do feel really strongly about. And noticing that if you do drive an awful lot, if you do drive a very, very large car, just being honest about the impact that it is having. And if you don't know very much, there's plenty that you can Google about it. And just trying to reduce it. I just keep saying to drive the smallest, lightest car you can as infrequently, as little as you can, basically. And you will make a very, very big difference. And not so much your own individual behaviour, but how much it snowballs and how much we're influenced by norms and people that we see doing things like that. And if you're somebody who did drive everywhere, if you did drive a very, very big car and you swapped and your colleague notices and you say, oh yeah, actually, I kind of heard this thing about that and I wanted to make a change. So when I next got my new car, I got a smaller car. And they'd be like, oh. And that is so powerful. That is the single most powerful thing, is somebody hearing something from someone who they identify with or they recognise as being like them. And there's no amount of people campaigning, till they're blue in the face to everyone to cycle. It is, you have got to make change, on a series of individual levels, but people have got to talk about it and speak about it.
Gosh, I love that. And actually, that is a wonderful way to end this, is actually become powerful. This is the thrust of what you're saying, isn't it? Become powerful.
Yeah, you are powerful. You have agency.
I was speaking with Zuhura Plummer. There are credits, photos and links to some of the things we talked about on the show notes page. Go to metrowild.co.uk and search for Zuhura, and that's spelt Zuhura. The views expressed by my guests are entirely their own and do not necessarily reflect my views. This podcast is part of the larger MetroWild magazine-style blog. Go to metrowild.co.uk to find a whole range of articles celebrating city life and wild nature. If you enjoyed this conversation with Zuhura Plummer, there are other episodes on the MetroWild podcast. For another Oxford view, have a listen to Truly Madly Hedgehogly, where ecologist Hugh Warwick talks about falling in love with hedgehogs. Or you can dip your toe into the sea with Yang-May Ooi and Zahim Al-Bakri in the episode The Call of the Seagrass, where they talk to me about their genre-defying musical show that is helping to save seagrass. I would be honoured if you followed the MetroWild podcast. You can find it wherever you get your podcasts, including Spotify and Audible. It's free. New episodes will then appear in your pod listening app as soon as I release them into the wild. A handy link to find the podcast is podfollow.com/MetroWild. The link to the full MetroWild multimedia magazine again is metrowild.co.uk. You can also like the MetroWild Facebook page at facebook.com/MetroWildUK. MetroWild is also on Instagram and YouTube as @MetroWildUK. I'm Yang-May Ooi. Thank you for listening and see you again soon.